The Tuscan evening wrapped around Florence like silk, warm and intoxicating, carrying the scent of olive groves and aged wine through the cobblestone streets. Diana Halden stood at the entrance of the rooftop restaurant, her navy dress perfectly tailored, her composure flawless despite the storm brewing in her chest. She had spent months planning this moment, her mother Odessa's 70th birthday celebration, a grand European tour that would crown decades of carefully orchestrated family gatherings. Every detail bore Diana's signature: the hand-selected wines, the carefully curated menu featuring dishes from 3 different regions, the lighting that would photograph beautifully for the inevitable social media posts. She had coordinated with florists in Rome, sommeliers in Tuscany, and photographers in Milan. Her company, Halden Events, had invested not just money but reputation into making this week unforgettable. But as Diana approached the long table set, beneath twinkling lights and manicured olive trees, a familiar chill ran down her spine. 13 place cards were arranged in perfect calligraphy, each name scripted in soft gold lettering. She counted twice, her trained eye scanning the arrangement with professional precision. Odessa at the head, surrounded by cousins, family friends, board members, and there at her right hand Vivian, her mother's newest protege. Diana's name was nowhere to be found. The absence wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. For 38 years, Diana had been dancing around the edges of her mother's spotlight, always present but never quite visible, always contributing but never quite credited. This was simply the most public erasure in a lifetime of subtle removals. "Sweetheart," Odessa's voice cut through the evening air like crystal against stone. She approached with that practiced smile that had charmed donors and board members for decades. "You look tired. Maybe you don't need to stay for the entire dinner. You've already done so much work behind the scenes." The dismissal was wrapped in concern, delivered with the kind of maternal warmth that would look caring to observers but felt like ice to Diana. She had heard variations of this her entire life, the gentle suggestions that she step back, let others take the spotlight, remain in the shadows where she belonged. Callum, her ex-husband, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Maybe someone just miscounted the place settings," he offered weakly, though his arm was already brushing against Vivian's, his attention already divided between old loyalties and new attractions. Diana studied the table one more time. Every napkin was folded with military precision, every wine glass filled to the exact same level, every detail orchestrated to perfection. This wasn't a mistake, it was a statement. After everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed, she was still considered optional. "I see," Diana said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "I'll leave you to your celebration." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the terracotta tiles with measured precision. Behind her, she could hear the gentle murmur of conversation resuming, the soft clink of glasses being raised in toasts she would never hear. In the marble hallway leading to the staff preparation area, Diana paused to collect herself. The walls were adorned with classical artwork, each piece carefully selected to create an atmosphere of timeless elegance. She had chosen every painting, approved every frame, coordinated every lighting fixture to highlight the beauty of the space. "Siora Halden?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Marco, one of the senior waiters, approached with obvious hesitation. His face carried the kind of apologetic expression that comes before unwelcome news. "Your name was on the seating chart this morning," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. "I saw it myself when we were setting up. But this afternoon, a new version came through. Your name had been removed." He paused, searching for words. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know." Diana felt something shift inside her, not surprise, but recognition. This was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. Every small slight, every gentle exclusion, every time she had been edited out of family photos or forgotten in introductions, had been building toward this precise instant. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. In a world where everyone else seemed complicit in her erasure, this stranger's honesty felt like a lifeline. She made her way to the full-length mirror beside the wine cabinet and studied her reflection. The woman staring back was impeccably dressed, professionally composed, and completely invisible to the people who were supposed to love her most. Her hair was pinned in a sophisticated updo, her makeup applied with the kind of precision that came from decades of attending events where appearance mattered more than presence. But there was something different in her eyes tonight, a clarity that hadn't been there before. For the first time in years, Diana saw herself not as the daughter desperately seeking approval, but as the woman who had built an empire while being systematically erased from its history. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. At 11, she had been excluded from the family trip to see the Nutcracker in New York. Odessa's excuse had been that Diana was sick with the flu, but the truth was that Diana had a spelling bee that same weekend, an achievement that apparently wasn't worth celebrating. At 17, when she had brought Callum home for the first time, Odessa had immediately begun planting seeds of doubt about their relationship, suggesting he wasn't long-term material for reasons that became clear only years later when he proved himself useful to Odessa's social circle. Even Diana's wedding had been orchestrated to center Odessa. The photographer had been instructed to capture more shots of the mother of the bride than the bride herself. Diana had spent her wedding day slightly out of frame, a supporting character in what should have been her own story. Diana walked back toward the dining area, her steps measured and purposeful. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the warm evening air, creating a symphony of celebration that she had orchestrated but was not invited to join. She positioned herself at the edge of the terrace, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain unnoticed. Odessa was in her element, holding court at the center of the table, like a queen presiding over her subjects. She raised her champagne flute with theatrical grace, her emerald dress catching the light from the carefully positioned fixtures that Diana had spent weeks selecting. The toast was everything Diana had scripted: elegant, heartfelt, perfectly timed for maximum emotional impact. But it was the seating arrangement that told the real story. Vivian sat at Odessa's right hand, positioned like a crown princess waiting for coronation. She nodded at all the right moments, laughed at all the appropriate jokes, and accepted compliments with the kind of gracious humility that comes naturally to those who have never had to fight for their place at the table. Diana waited until the laughter reached its peak, until the moment when her voice would carry clearly across the terrace. Then she spoke, her words cutting through the celebration like a blade through silk. "It seems I'm not family anymore." The words weren't loud, weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of decades of accumulated hurt. 12 heads turned toward her in unison, their expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to something that might have been relief that the awkwardness was finally being addressed. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody reached out to pull her into the circle or offer explanations or apologies. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Diana realized that this moment, this public acknowledgement of her exclusion, was exactly what some of them had been waiting for. She turned and walked away, her dignity intact, but her heart shattered. Behind her, she could hear the gentle murmur of conversation resuming, the careful reconstruction of the celebration she had built, but was not allowed to enjoy. Diana's suite at the Grand Palazzo was a masterpiece of Italian luxury floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Arno River, crown molding that spoke of centuries of craftsmanship, and a king-size bed made with military precision. She had designed every aspect of the accommodations, from the thread count of the sheets to the placement of the fresh flowers that greeted guests upon arrival. But tonight, the opulent surroundings felt like a prison. She stood on the balcony, watching the river flow beneath the ancient bridges, its surface reflecting the lights of the city like scattered diamonds. In her mind, she wasn't seeing the romantic beauty of Florence. She was replaying every moment of the evening, every subtle slight, every calculated exclusion. The tablet in her hands contained the complete itinerary for the week-long celebration. Page after page of carefully coordinated events, each one bearing her digital signature, each one representing hours of planning and thousands of dollars in investment. Her name appeared on every vendor contract, every payment authorization, every logistical detail. She had built this celebration from the ground up, and yet she had been systematically erased from its narrative. Sleep was impossible. Diana spent the night pacing the marble floors, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She had built her career on the principle that events should be flawless, that every detail should serve the greater story being told. But what happened when the story being told was a lie? The next morning brought a thin envelope slipped under her door, cream cardstock with gold trim, the kind of invitation that suggested exclusivity and importance. Inside was the press itinerary for the week's media events, complete with interview schedules, photo opportunities, and a detailed timeline for the birthday gala. Diana's name appeared nowhere in the document, not as event producer, not as coordinator, not even in the acknowledgments section where vendor credits were typically listed. Instead, Viven's name appeared twice, once as legacy partner and again as brand liaison, titles that Diana had never heard before, but that clearly positioned the younger woman as Odessa's chosen successor. The phone call to her publicist, Marco, confirmed what Diana already suspected. Odessa had explicitly requested that Diana be kept out of the media coverage, claiming that she preferred to stay behind the scenes and was feeling overwhelmed by the attention. The lies were delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made them impossible to challenge without seeming unstable or difficult. Diana didn't argue. She had learned long ago that defending yourself against lies often made you look more guilty than remaining silent. Instead, she thanked Marco for his honesty and hung up, her mind already calculating the implications of what she had discovered. Later that afternoon, Diana made her way to the conference suite where the technical crew was preparing for the evening's birthday tribute. The room buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that preceded major events, cables being arranged, lighting being adjusted, screens being calibrated for optimal viewing. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who belonged there, because she did belong there. Every technical specification had been approved by her, every vendor relationship had been negotiated through her company, every detail had been orchestrated to serve the vision she had spent months developing. "We're loading the final tribute video," Marco, the technical director, informed her. "Would you like to preview it?" Diana nodded, her expression neutral but her pulse quickening. She had provided dozens of family photos and video clips for the tribute, carefully selecting images that would tell the story of Odessa's life with warmth and authenticity. She had spent hours organizing the materials chronologically, writing suggested narrative threads, and coordinating with the video production team to ensure the final product would be worthy of the occasion. The screen flickered to life, and Diana watched herself disappear. The early footage was exactly what she had expected: adorable clips of young Odessa at various family gatherings, professional photos from her early career, heartwarming moments with extended family and friends. Diana appeared in many of these early scenes, a constant presence in her mother's life from childhood through young adulthood, but somewhere around the halfway point, Diana began to fade from the narrative. The more recent footage focused entirely on Odessa's professional achievements and public appearances, with Viven appearing increasingly frequently as the chosen companion for charity events, award ceremonies, and social gatherings. The final segment was titled Legacy and Future, and it featured exclusively recent footage of Odessa and Viven together, laughing at gallery openings, embracing at charity galas, and sharing intimate moments that suggested a deep bond between mentor and protege. Odessa's voiceover played like a eulogy to herself. "I've always believed that legacy is about who stands beside you, not just where you've been, but who you trust to carry the light forward." Diana didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't allow any emotion to show on her face. But inside, she was calculating the precise moment when everything had changed, when she had gone from being the daughter who would carry on the family legacy to being the obstacle that needed to be removed. Diana returned to her suite and opened her laptop, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. She had spent her career documenting events, creating detailed records of every decision and every expense. Now, those same organizational skills would serve a different purpose. She began compiling evidence of her systematic erasure, screenshots of emails, copies of contracts, documentation of her financial contributions to the celebration. Every piece of evidence was time-stamped, cross-referenced, and organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made her one of the most sought-after event planners in the industry. The smoking gun came in the form of an email thread that had been forwarded to her by mistake. In it, Odessa had explicitly instructed her assistant to keep Diana out of the promotional visuals because it confuses the brand hierarchy. The message was dated 4 days earlier, proving that her exclusion had been planned and deliberate rather than accidental. Diana stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family drama. This was about systematic fraud. Her company had invested tens of thousands of dollars in this celebration. Her name was on every contract, and yet she was being erased from the very event she had created. She opened a new document and began typing, her words flowing with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding the truth. This wasn't a family dispute, it was a business betrayal. And Diana had built her career on the principle that betrayal should have consequences. The next morning, Diana found Odessa on the hotel's rooftop terrace, standing alone at the stone balustrade that overlooked the city. Her mother cut an elegant figure against the Tuscan skyline, her silver hair catching the morning light, her posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being the center of attention. "Darling," Odessa greeted her with that practiced charm that had won over donors and board members for decades. "You've been so quiet. I hope you're not letting the press arrangements get under your skin. It's just optics, not affection." Diana approached slowly, allowing the silence to stretch between them until it became uncomfortable. She had spent her entire life trying to bridge the gap between them, but now she understood that the gap had been intentional, a moat designed to keep her at exactly the right distance. "You don't get to call it affection when you're systematically erasing me," Diana said, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about press optics or brand hierarchy. This is about you rewriting history to serve your narrative." Odessa's expression flickered surprise, perhaps, or the realization that her daughter was no longer the malleable girl who had spent decades seeking approval. "I'm not trying to erase you," she replied carefully. "I'm trying to preserve momentum." Vivian connects with the younger demographic. The press responds to her energy. Diana let out a small, tired laugh. "You mean she doesn't remind them that you're old enough to have a daughter my age?" The silence that followed was answer enough. For years, Diana had been climbing what she thought was a ladder toward her mother's approval. But now she understood that it had always been a treadmill and Odessa had been controlling the speed. "You built this story, Mother," Diana said softly. "Just don't be surprised when it stops going the way you planned." Diana spent the rest of the day in the hotel's business center, surrounded by printouts and confirmation emails. Every vendor, contract, every payment authorization, every logistical detail was spread across the mahogany conference table like evidence in a court case. Her company had fronted more than half the costs for the week-long celebration. The yacht in Capri, the private villa in Tuscany, the exclusive Vatican tour, the vineyard dinner, all of it had been booked through Halden Events, with Diana's signature on every contract, and her company's credit guaranteeing every expense. If they wanted to build a legacy without her, they could do it without her support. One by one, she began making calls. The vineyard manager in Tuscany was warm and professional, expressing regret that the Halden Events Group would no longer be requiring their services. The yacht captain in Capri was understanding about the change in plans, confirming that the deposit would be refunded within 48 hours. The cultural liaison at the Vatican was apologetic about any inconvenience, but grateful for the advance notice. Each conversation was conducted with professional courtesy, each cancellation explained as a simple change in itinerary. Diana didn't mention family drama or personal conflicts, she simply informed each vendor that Halden Events would no longer be coordinating the Caldwell Group's activities. By the time she finished the final call, the entire elaborate celebration had been dismantled. The Roman villa was available for other guests, the private yacht was returned to the charter company, and the exclusive dining experiences were open to new bookings. Diana closed her laptop and leaned back in the leather chair, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of consequences matching actions. They had wanted to erase her from their story, now they could tell that story without the foundation she had built. That evening, Diana dressed for the birthday gala with the kind of precision she usually reserved for her most important clients. The navy velvet gown had been purchased months earlier, selected for its elegance and understated sophistication. She had never intended to wear it as armor, but that's what it had become. She arrived at the ballroom early, moving through the space with the confidence of someone who had designed every detail. The chandeliers cast warm light over the marble floors, the floral arrangements created perfect photo opportunities, and the acoustics had been calibrated to ensure that every speech would be heard clearly throughout the room. From her position near the service entrance, Diana watched the evening unfold exactly as she had planned it. Odessa held court at the center of the room, resplendent in emerald silk, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs with the kind of practiced grace that came from decades of being celebrated. Vivian stood at her right hand, playing the role of devoted protege with convincing authenticity. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes, and accepted compliments with the kind of gracious humility that endeared her to the assembled guests. The speeches were everything Diana had scripted: heartfelt tributes to Odessa's contributions to charity, her dedication to family, and her vision for the future. The tribute video played flawlessly, its carefully edited narrative presenting a story of legacy and continuity that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth. But as the evening progressed, small cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed facade. The waitstaff seemed confused about payment arrangements, the photographer kept asking about shot lists that apparently didn't exist, and the evening's coordinator appeared increasingly frazzled as various vendors requested confirmation of their contracts. Diana watched from the shadows as Marco, the maitre d', approached Odessa's table during dessert. She was too far away to hear the conversation, but she could see the moment when confusion turned to concern, when Odessa's practiced smile began to waver. The corporate card was declined. The backup payment method was insufficient. The elaborate celebration that had been planned to showcase Odessa's success was crumbling under the weight of its own expense. Diana slipped out of the ballroom before the full scope of the financial crisis became apparent. She had seen enough. The careful construction of Odessa's legacy was collapsing without the foundation that Diana had provided. The next morning brought a flurry of phone calls and frantic emails. Vendors across Europe were reporting payment issues, media outlets were asking questions about the canceled events, and Odessa's team was scrambling to control the narrative. Diana's phone buzzed with a call from her publicist. "Don't panic," he said, his voice tight with professional concern. "Odessa's team is trying to manage the fallout. They're already feeding stories to the gossip blogs." "What kind of stories?" Diana asked, though she already knew the answer. "That you had an emotional breakdown. That you sabotaged your own mother's celebration out of jealousy. There's already a headline making the rounds: event planner sabotages mother's milestone birthday." Diana felt a familiar calm settle over her. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, the moment when standing up for herself would be reframed as mental instability, when protecting her own interests would be painted as selfishness. "They're spinning it hard," her publicist continued. "You need to respond before it gains more traction." But Diana had no intention of responding to their narrative. Instead, she had prepared her own. Diana had spent years building relationships with journalists, photographers, and media professionals who valued authenticity over sensationalism. Now, she called in those favors. The journalist she contacted was someone she had worked with on several high-profile events, a woman who had built her career on uncovering truth rather than perpetuating myth. Diana laid out the evidence methodically, the email threads documenting her systematic erasure, the vendor contracts proving her financial investment, the timeline showing how her contributions had been appropriated while her presence was eliminated. "I don't want revenge," Diana explained. "I want accuracy. I want the truth to be louder than the fiction they're selling." The journalist nodded, her expression serious. "You're not the first person Odessa has tried to rewrite out of history, but you might be the first with enough documentation to prove it." The article was published within 48 hours, complete with screenshots of the incriminating emails and copies of the vendor contracts. It painted a picture not of a daughter's jealous breakdown, but of a systematic campaign to appropriate credit while eliminating accountability. The headline was simple and devastating: "The Invisible Contributor: How One Woman Built Her Mother's Legacy Then Reclaimed It." Diana didn't wait for the article to gain traction. She packed her belongings methodically, leaving the Grand Palazzo with the same precision she had brought to every aspect of the celebration. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no tearful confrontations, just a quiet departure that spoke louder than any speech. At the airport, she upgraded to first class, using points her company had accumulated over years of successful events. As the plane lifted off from Florence, she looked down at the city that had been the setting for her liberation rather than her humiliation. The emails began arriving before she landed in Chicago. Vendors expressing confusion about payment issues, journalists asking for comment on the developing story, and colleagues offering support for her decision to protect her business interests. But it was the handwritten note that arrived a week later that surprised her most. No return address, just Odessa's distinctive handwriting on expensive stationery. I regret how this was handled. You are stronger than I gave you credit for. It wasn't an apology. Odessa had never been capable of true apologies, but it was acknowledgement, and for Diana, that was enough. 6 months later, Diana stood on a sun-drenched terrace in Positano, clipboard in hand, finalizing details for a celebrity wedding that would be featured in 3 major magazines. The air smelled of sea salt and lemon trees, and the laughter behind her was genuine, the kind of joy that came from celebration rather than obligation. You're the woman who walked away from that family drama in Florence, aren't you? Asked a junior planner, her voice filled with admiration rather than judgment. Diana smiled, but didn't answer directly. Some stories were worth telling, others were worth living. The woman who had stood invisible at the edge of that rooftop restaurant was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the difference between family loyalty and self-respect. Her business had grown significantly in the months since Florence. Clients were drawn to her reputation for authenticity and her refusal to compromise her principles for the sake of maintaining comfortable lives. The events she planned now were built on genuine relationships and mutual respect rather than obligation and manipulation. On quiet evenings in her Chicago apartment, Diana would sometimes open the leather journal she had started in Florence. The early entries were filled with pain and confusion, but the later ones chronicled a different kind of story, one about reclaiming agency, about choosing truth over comfort, about building something real rather than perpetuating something false. She had learned that forgiveness didn't always require reconciliation, that love didn't always require sacrifice of self, and that the most powerful legacy was the one you built for yourself rather than the one you inherited from others. The gossip about the Florence incident had faded, replaced by other scandals and other stories. Vivian had quietly disappeared from Odessa's circle, apparently having learned that being the chosen successor was less appealing when the foundation was built on shifting sand. Diana received occasional updates about her mother's activities, smaller events, more intimate gatherings, celebrations that bore the hallmarks of reduced circumstances rather than expanded vision. But she felt no satisfaction in Odessa's struggles, no vindication in her mother's diminished influence. The real victory wasn't in Odessa's downfall, it was in Diana's rise. She had learned to build her own table instead of waiting for someone else to offer her a chair. She had discovered that the most powerful stories were the ones you wrote yourself, with your own pen, in your own voice. 2 years after Florence, Diana received an invitation to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs. The topic was building your brand while staying true to your values, and as she stood on the stage looking out at an audience of ambitious, creative women, she thought about the journey that had brought her there. She talked about the importance of documentation, about the power of walking away from situations that diminished your worth, about the difference between being edited out of someone else's story and writing your own. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions about business strategy and personal boundaries, but it was the question from a young woman in the back row that stayed with her long after the conference ended. How do you forgive someone who tried to make you invisible? Diana paused, considering the question carefully. I don't think forgiveness is about absolving someone else of their actions, she said finally. I think it's about refusing to let their actions define your future. It's about choosing to be visible on your own terms rather than waiting for someone else to see you. The applause was warm and sustained, but Diana barely heard it. She was thinking about the woman she had been in Florence, desperate for acknowledgement, willing to accept scraps of recognition, believing that her worth was determined by other people's opinions. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that the most profound act of rebellion was simply refusing to disappear. Diana had discovered that you don't have to stay where you're not valued, that you don't have to participate in your own erasure, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to love yourself enough to leave. As she left the stage that day, Diana felt the weight of her own story not as a burden, but as a foundation. She had built something beautiful from the wreckage of her family's expectations, something authentic from the ashes of their manipulation. She was no longer the invisible daughter, the forgotten contributor, the woman standing at the edge of someone else's celebration. She was Diana Halden, successful entrepreneur, respected professional, and most importantly, the author of her own story, and that story was still being written, one choice at a time, one boundary at a time. one moment of self-respect at a time. The pen was in her hand now, and she intended to use it well. The end was really just the beginning of a life lived on her own terms, with her own voice, in her own light. And for the first time in 38 years, Diana was exactly where she belonged, visible, valued, and finally, truly free.